The passengers aboard Flight 301 were in high spirits as they boarded the airplane. It was a clear, sunny day, and the air was crisp with the promise of a smooth journey. The excitement was palpable. This was not just any flight, it was a vacation, an escape to a tropical paradise. Families, couples, and solo travelers all shared the same destination, a remote island known for its crystal-clear waters, lush jungles, and the perfect balance of adventure and relaxation. Lily, a bright-eyed 9-year-old, was sitting by the window with her parents. Her excitement bubbled over as she gazed out at the airport runway. She couldn't wait to see the sparkling blue ocean when they finally arrived. She had always dreamed of visiting a place like this, where the beaches stretched endlessly, and the palm trees swayed in the warm breeze. Her parents, though, were focused on their quiet conversations and the soft hum of the airplane engine as it began to taxi toward the runway. Lily's gaze wandered around the cabin, and she noticed Mr. Thompson, a businessman seated across the aisle from her. He was engrossed in his laptop, furiously typing away with a look of deep concentration on his face. He was well dressed in a suit, his tie slightly askew as if he hadn't had the time to fix it properly. Lily knew he must have been on an important work trip, but his stern face seemed out of place in a vacation-bound airplane. She imagined him dreaming of getting the trip over with so he could return to his office and his paperwork. The cabin crew moved briskly through the aisles, offering drinks and checking seat belts. The flight attendants smiled politely at the passengers, their movements graceful as they prepared for takeoff. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing the expected flight time and reassuring everyone that the conditions for the journey were perfect. "It's a smooth day for flying," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. Lily felt the plane begin to rumble as the engines roared to life. She gripped the armrest in excitement as the wheels of the plane lifted off the ground, and soon, the airplane was soaring high above the clouds. Outside, the sky was a brilliant shade of blue, unmarred by any clouds. Lily pressed her face against the window, watching as the landscape below grew smaller and smaller. She loved flying. There was something magical about seeing the world from so high up, a patchwork of green and brown dotted with tiny roads and houses. The thought of visiting an island surrounded by vast ocean only added to her excitement. Meanwhile, Mr. Thompson continued working, occasionally glancing out of the window but mostly lost in his emails and reports. He had never been a fan of flying, but the work he was doing was critical, and he didn't have time to enjoy the ride. He briefly noticed a slight hum in the air, but it didn't register as anything out of the ordinary. Planes always made strange noises, after all. The steady, mechanical whir of the engines had a rhythm to it, one that often faded into the background of his thoughts. Lily's excitement, however, grew as the plane climbed higher. She could feel her ears popping from the change in altitude, and she loved the way her stomach fluttered as the plane banked slightly to the left. She was surrounded by strangers, but it felt like the entire world was her playground. As the seatbelt sign blinked off, she unbuckled herself and eagerly reached into her backpack for her favorite book, ready to dive into the adventures of her beloved character. She wasn't worried about anything. To her, the flight was perfect. Above them, the sky stretched endlessly, with the sun casting golden rays across the expanse. The flight attendants returned to the aisles, now offering snacks and drinks to the passengers. The soft chatter filled the cabin as everyone settled into their routine for the journey. Lily's mother leaned over to whisper something in her ear, but Lily was already lost in the pages of her book. The world inside the plane was calm, the turbulence of everyday life left far behind on the ground below. But not everything was as it seemed. In the cockpit, the pilots were having a quiet discussion. Captain Allen, a seasoned pilot with over 20 years of experience, exchanged a concerned look with his co-pilot, Sarah. There was nothing overtly alarming, but something felt off. The plane's engines, though steady, had begun to hum at a slightly higher frequency, like an eerie background hum that echoed in the cockpit. Captain Allen reached forward and adjusted the dials, but the sound persisted. It was faint, almost imperceptible to the untrained ear, but it was there. Sarah glanced at the instrument panel, checking the readings. The plane's altitude, speed, and trajectory were all normal. Nothing suggested any malfunction. But the hum, growing just a little louder, gnawed at the back of her mind. She tried to focus, reminding herself that this was just part of the job. Small anomalies were common in air travel. Still, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Down below, in the cabin, the hum was barely perceptible, lost in the noise of the air conditioning and the occasional cough from a passenger. Lily, still absorbed in her book, didn't notice it at all. Mr. Thompson, however, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, rubbing his temple as if trying to ease a headache. The plane continued its smooth flight, cruising above the clouds, unaware that the perfect journey was about to take a turn none of its passengers could have predicted. The sky seemed endless, the world outside tranquil and serene, but the hum in the air held an unspoken warning. The calm that had enveloped the passengers of Flight 301 was shattered in an instant. The first sign of trouble came without warning, a sudden, bone-rattling jolt that threw the plane off course. The gentle hum of the engines turned into a deafening roar as the entire aircraft shuddered violently. The overhead lights flickered and then went dark, plunging the cabin into an eerie, unnatural dimness. A hiss of pressure escaped from somewhere in the walls, and the sound of metal creaking under strain filled the air. Lily gasped as her small body was tossed out of her seat, slamming into the armrest with a sharp thud. Her mother's scream cut through the chaos, but it was quickly drowned out by the cacophony of alarms that blared from the cockpit. The seatbelt sign flashed red, a frantic, urgent reminder to buckle up. But no one had time to react. Passengers were thrown from their seats, some hitting the aisles, others clutching at the armrests with a desperate grip. The plane lurched again, the force of it sending everything flying. Lily's heart raced in her chest as she tried to right herself. Her vision blurred, her ears rang with the sounds of terror, and the world outside seemed to spin wildly. She heard shouting, muffled, distant voices crying out in fear, but her own voice was lost among the cacophony. The plane pitched violently to the side, and for a brief moment, it felt as though they might be turned upside down. Everything that was once familiar became disorienting, as if the very fabric of reality had been torn apart. In the cockpit, Captain Allen fought to maintain control. His hands gripped the yoke tightly as he scanned the instrument panel, the warning lights flashing in a frantic rhythm. The engines sputtered, stuttered, and then roared back to life, but it was clear they were no longer responding to his commands. He shouted to Sarah, but his words were lost in the din of alarms and the pounding noise that reverberated through the plane's frame. "Sarah! What the hell's happening?" he demanded, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her voice strained with panic. "Something's wrong with the engines. We're losing power, Captain." The plane lurched again, and Captain Allen gritted his teeth, trying to steady the aircraft as it veered dangerously toward a sharp descent. The air was thick with the smell of burning fuel, a noxious odor that made his stomach churn. The wings creaked as if protesting the violent movements, and the plane groaned under the pressure of an uncontrolled descent. Back in the cabin, the passengers were in complete panic. It was as though time had slowed down, and yet everything was moving so fast. The seatbelt sign was blinking erratically, but some passengers, paralyzed by fear, couldn't even reach for their belts. A young woman near the back of the plane was crying, clutching her baby to her chest, while an older man shouted for help, his voice trembling with terror. Others scrambled to the overhead compartments, desperate to retrieve their belongings, as if those few possessions could offer some kind of comfort amid the chaos. Lily clung to her seat, trying to ignore the waves of panic crashing over her. Her heart was pounding so hard that she felt as if it might burst from her chest. Her hands, still trembling, reached for her mother, who was now shouting at her father, both of them struggling to keep their composure in the face of the terrifying descent. Through the blurry haze of her fear, Lily thought she saw Mr. Thompson, the businessman, now unbuckled from his seat and attempting to help the people around him. His face was pale, his normally composed demeanor shattered by the madness unfolding before him. Another jolt sent Lily's stomach into her throat, and she was forced to bite down on her lip to stop herself from screaming. She could see other passengers around her, their faces etched with the same terror she felt, but no one could do anything to stop the plane from its rapid descent toward the earth. It was like they were all falling into an abyss, and there was no escape. The crew, too, was scrambling. Flight attendants hurried down the aisles, trying to reassure passengers, urging them to buckle up, to stay calm. But their own panic was evident. One of them, a young woman with blonde hair, stumbled over a fallen passenger's suitcase, barely regaining her balance. She was shaking, her face pale, but she still managed to offer words of comfort. "We'll be fine, folks. Just stay calm. We'll land safely." But it was a lie. No one knew what was going to happen. Outside the windows, the sky, once clear and blue, now appeared ominous. Dark, swirling clouds had gathered in the distance, casting an eerie shadow over the aircraft. It seemed as though the very heavens themselves were closing in. The wind outside howled in fury, making the plane tremble even more violently. Lily turned her head to the window, her gaze drawn to the horizon. Below, the world was a blur of greenery and earth, but there was no sign of the airport or any nearby civilization. The plane was falling faster now, and the ground below seemed to rise up with terrifying speed. In the cockpit, the situation had gone from bad to worse. The control systems were failing one by one, and Captain Allen knew they were running out of time. The ground was coming up fast, and he could feel the plane losing altitude with every passing second. He shouted over the intercom, trying to steady the passengers, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of the wind and the ever-increasing roar of the engines. "This is your captain speaking," he said, trying to sound calm, though his voice was tight with urgency. "We are experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." But before he could finish, the plane gave one final, terrifying lurch. The world outside the window tilted sharply, and then, with an earth-shaking crash, everything went dark. The impact was deafening, a cataclysmic explosion of metal and fire. The plane tore through the trees, skimming over the jagged rocks below, before slamming into the ground with a sickening thud. When the plane came to a sudden stop, it felt as though time itself had been ripped apart. For a moment, everything was still. The world outside the cabin was nothing but a haze of smoke, fire, and twisted metal. The wreckage of Flight 301 lay scattered across the jungle floor, the mangled fuselage half buried in thick, dense vegetation. Lily's eyes snapped open. Her body ached, her chest tight with the remnants of the crash. She had no memory of how she had survived, only that her seatbelt had held, and that the impact had somehow spared her life. The stench of smoke and burning rubber clung to the air, and the ground beneath her was damp and uneven. She blinked several times, her vision blurry, and then she tried to push herself upright. "Mom? Dad?" she called out, her voice weak and trembling. Her ears rang from the impact, and the forest around her seemed to be alive with strange noises, birds calling in the distance, rustling leaves, and the occasional crackling of the still burning wreckage. She tried to focus, to shake off the grogginess, but everything felt wrong. Her head throbbed painfully as she crawled through the wreckage, her hands covered in dirt and soot. It was then that she realized just how far from civilization they had crashed. Lily's heart raced with fear, and panic began to claw at her chest. The world around her was unrecognizable, wild and untamed. The trees were enormous, their gnarled roots twisted into the ground like ancient guardians. Vines hung from their branches, thick with the humidity of the jungle. She could hear the faint chirping of insects, the rustle of unseen creatures moving in the underbrush. The smell of the forest was both earthy and sweet, but it did little to comfort her. "Mom! Dad!" she cried again, her voice growing desperate. It was then that she saw them, her mother, lying unconscious a few feet away. She scrambled toward her, her hands trembling as she checked for signs of life. There was a pulse, faint but steady. Relief flooded through her, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of urgency. She couldn't stay there. There was no telling how long the crash site would remain safe. The wreckage was already starting to smolder, and the rising smoke suggested that more fuel might ignite at any moment. She glanced around frantically, searching for any sign of her father. After a brief moment of panic, her eyes locked onto him. He was not far off, tangled in a pile of debris, but he, too, appeared to be alive. His leg was pinned beneath some twisted metal, and he groaned softly, his face contorted with pain. "Hold on, Dad!" Lily cried out as she rushed to his side. With all the strength she could muster, she began pulling at the metal, trying to free her father from the wreckage. He stirred but didn't wake up fully. His face was pale, covered in sweat, his breath shallow. He was alive, but only just. Lily's thoughts raced. She couldn't stay here. There was no help coming any time soon. They needed to get out of the wreckage, away from the smoke and the fire. She glanced around the clearing. There was no sign of anyone else. The jungle was eerily quiet, the sound of the crash fading into the background as the survivors, if there were any, started to come to terms with their new reality. She grabbed a piece of broken metal from the wreckage and used it to pry her father's leg loose. With a final tug, she managed to pull him free. She winced at the pain in his face as she helped him sit up. He groaned in agony, his eyes flickering open. "Lily, what happened?" he whispered, his voice weak. "We crashed," she said, her throat tight with fear. "We need to get out of here." He looked around, his eyes growing wide as he took in the surrounding jungle. "The others, where are the others?" "I don't know. I haven't seen anyone else." Her voice trembled. "But we have to leave. It's too dangerous here." Before he could respond, a voice came from behind them. "Are you all right?" Lily spun around, startled, her breath catching in her throat. It was Mr. Thompson, the businessman from across the aisle. His suit was torn and covered in dirt, but he was alive. His face was drawn, but there was a glimmer of determination in his eyes. "We need to move," Mr. Thompson said, his voice firm. "The crash site is not safe. There's a fire, and we need to get out before it spreads." Lily nodded, but fear still gripped her heart. The jungle stretched endlessly before them, an untamed wilderness filled with unknown dangers. They were stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no food, no water, and no way of contacting anyone for help. Her father, though weakened by the crash, managed to push himself to his feet, leaning heavily on Lily for support. Together, with Mr. Thompson leading the way, they began to make their way through the dense jungle, leaving the wreckage behind. The heat from the fire was already beginning to intensify as they moved deeper into the jungle. They walked through thick undergrowth, occasionally tripping over roots and fallen branches. Lily's heart pounded in her chest, and her thoughts raced as she tried to take in her surroundings. She couldn't focus on anything except the overwhelming sense of fear that gripped her. And yet, even as they struggled to navigate the treacherous terrain, something about the jungle seemed to pull at them, something ancient and wild, as if the earth itself was watching them. The air was thick with humidity, the trees towering above them like sentinels guarding secrets long forgotten. The path ahead was uncertain, but they had no choice but to press forward. Days passed, though time felt warped in the thick of the jungle. The survivors, Lily, her father, Mr. Thompson, and a handful of others they had found along the way, struggled to adapt. They managed to scavenge some supplies from the wreckage, but their meager rations were quickly running out. Water was scarce, and the dense forest offered little in terms of sustenance. The jungle seemed alive in a way they hadn't anticipated. Its sounds, smells, and shifting shadows were constant reminders that they were intruders in a world far older than they could comprehend. They had set up camp near a small stream, its waters cool and refreshing, but its source was a mystery. The survivors had taken turns keeping watch, each of them haunted by the fear of what the jungle might hide: wild animals, poisonous plants, or perhaps something far darker. Still, their greatest threat remained the same: their isolation. The wreckage of the plane lay far behind them, a distant memory now, and no sign of rescue had come. The world they knew seemed so far away, and they had no idea if anyone was looking for them. It was on the fourth night that the sky began to change. Lily had always loved stargazing, and despite the uncertainty of their situation, she found herself drawn to the stars again. She sat on the ground, legs crossed, gazing up at the glittering night sky. The constellations were faint, almost obscured by the haze of smoke still drifting in the air from the crash site. Yet, as she watched, a soft breeze stirred the trees, carrying with it a sound that caught her attention, a faint, almost imperceptible hum. It was the same hum she had heard on the plane before it fell. It was as though the air itself was vibrating with a quiet, desperate pulse. Lily stood up, her heart pounding as the sound grew louder. She felt an inexplicable pull toward it, as if the sound was calling to her. The others were fast asleep, their forms wrapped in blankets or curled beneath the makeshift shelter, but Lily could not shake the feeling that something was reaching out to her, something beyond the jungle, beyond the wreckage, beyond the plane. "Dad!" she whispered, but he didn't stir. The campfire crackled quietly beside them, casting long shadows against the trees. Lily took a deep breath, her mind racing with questions. She knew that the jungle was full of mysteries, some that might never be solved, but the hum felt different. It wasn't just the sound of the wind, or the shifting of the trees, it felt like a message. A warning. Or perhaps a guide. "Come on!" she muttered to herself, though she wasn't sure why she was speaking out loud. Her instincts told her to follow the sound, but logic begged her to stay put. But deep within her, a quiet, almost ancient pull urged her forward, beyond the safety of their small camp and into the heart of the wilderness. Taking one last look at the others, Lily stepped away from the fire and into the darkness of the jungle. The hum led her onward, faint but persistent, guiding her like a thread through the labyrinth of trees. The forest seemed to open up before her as if it recognized her presence, parting just enough to allow her passage. The air was thick with moisture, the undergrowth soft beneath her feet as she pressed deeper into the night. Minutes turned into hours, and still, the hum persisted, growing ever stronger, ever clearer. Her heart raced as she pushed on, her determination growing with each step. Her mind raced through every possibility. What could this sound be? Was it the wind? The jungle playing tricks? Or was it something more, something beyond the ordinary world she knew? Finally, she reached a clearing, a space so still it felt almost sacred. The ground here was smooth, untouched by the chaos of the crash. In the center of the clearing stood a large rock formation, weathered by time and the elements, yet somehow standing strong, defiant against the passage of years. At the base of the rocks, something caught her eye, a glimmer of metal, hidden beneath vines and moss. Lily approached cautiously, her pulse quickening. As she drew closer, she saw it more clearly, a cockpit. A plane's cockpit, though old, its metal surface scratched and worn by the forces of time. It was strange and surreal, as if the jungle itself had swallowed it, only to reveal it now, as if beckoning her. The hum grew louder, vibrating through her bones. She knelt before the cockpit, its glass cracked and clouded with age, but she could still make out the faint outlines of the instruments inside. This was no ordinary find. This wasn't part of their plane. This was something else. A relic, perhaps, or a warning from another time. With trembling hands, Lily reached toward the broken cockpit, brushing away the vines that had wrapped themselves around it. She peered inside, her breath catching in her throat. There, etched into the metal, was a message. It was written in symbols she didn't recognize, a strange, ancient script that seemed to pulse with an energy she could feel in the air. Before she could process what she was seeing, a voice whispered in the wind. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there, as if the sky itself was speaking directly to her. "The sky remembers." Lily froze, her mind racing. She had no idea what the message meant or why it had come to her, but somehow, deep down, she knew it was important. She knew it was a piece of the puzzle that would help them understand the crash, the jungle, and the forces at play in this mysterious, forgotten world. The sky had whispered, and Lily understood now. This wasn't just about surviving. It was about uncovering the truth, about understanding the connection between them, the jungle, and the sky that had watched over them. As she stood there, gazing at the cockpit, the sky above seemed to shift. The stars glimmered with newfound clarity, and Lily felt a sense of peace settle over her. The journey was far from over, but somehow, The answers were closer now. They just had to follow the whispers.